Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Study 753, Preserving Information Media Lecture. We'll be talking about migration and emulation, a couple of topics that we have referred to off and on throughout this semester already, but hopefully this will provide some additional context and understanding for you about these topics. Okay, so here are our weekly topics. Which actions can archives take to preserve digital records? How can these actions impact the authenticity of a record? And what are the benefits and detriments of each action? So we'll start by looking at migration. And this is probably the most common preservation action that archives take. It's kind of well-trod territory for archives. And the Gattuso article describes migration as being more aligned with informational preservation since the content of record is changed when it is migrated to a new format. So migration is essentially, as the Carta article notes, a transfer of digital objects from one software or hardware configuration to another. And as I just discussed, it usually involves a conversion of one file format into another. So the digital record is changed, not necessarily the environment that the digital record is in. As the Gattuso article notes, migration is really focused on the idea of transposing important parts of records into different and more accessible structures or more accessible formats. So exactly what these important parts are is obviously going to be something that your archive is going to need to discuss and have a conversation with the public and with researchers and stakeholders about which significant properties or essential characteristics or whatever you want to call them of a record should be preserved during migration. As the Carta notes, migration is great for simple records, and oftentimes it's simple records that can comprise the bulk of a collection. So migration is a preservation strategy that can be used quite broadly in archival digital holdings, which is certainly a benefit of it. It's sort of a broadly usable tool. However, with more complex records, migration, as Carta also notes, can take a lot of time and it can result in a loss of authenticity. And we'll talk about the connection between migration and emulation and authenticity later on, but that's just an important aspect of migration to understand. One thing that is important to consider when you're thinking about migration is you have to decide which tools you're going to use to migrate your records. And there are a lot of tools that archives can use for digital preservation for a variety of purposes. Looking at the tools that are available out there, it seems like migration is a subset of tools that is a little underdeveloped, and there are only a few tools that archives can use to migrate records. So that might be something that that does get in the way of the migration of electronic records. And there has to be some kind of automation involved too. There has to be a way for this process to occur automatically and with very little, if any, archival interaction. If you consider that, you know, a single collection or a single hard drive can contain maybe hundreds or thousands of files, you just can't go through and migrate those hand by hand by hand. You have to have a tool that can really automate and take over that process so that it's not a very labor-intensive process for archivists to complete. Another thing about migration is that is going to result in the creation of additional records that archives need to maintain. So here we have our file in its original format. And once this file is ingested and brought into the repository, it's usually kept in dark storage. So storage that is only accessible by one or two individuals and kind of shielded from the public, and maybe even shielded from a lot of the staff members that work at an archive. But what may happen, or what happens with migration, is that the file is migrated to a different format, a format that is maybe less of a risk for obsolescence or just easier to preserve and provide access to overall. And this is the file that the public will interact with. But of course, as time progresses, files may be, access files, migrated files may be migrated into different formats themselves. So say you have a TIFF file and you migrate it into a JPEG. Say there are changes in JPEG file formatting and you feel like a different version of a JPEG is better for long-term preservation, so you might migrate all of your JPEGs into this new type of JPEG. And then maybe that happens again down the road. So, every time you migrate something, you're at least creating one additional copy of it, if not more. And so obviously that can have implications for things like storage and needing to track and maintain the migrated files themselves. And, it can turn into quite a bit for archives to deal with. Another important thing that archives need to be aware of is just being aware of what kind of files they should migrate records to. And that's something that is particularly important when it comes to normalization, which is something that the University of Florida article for this week touches on. So this process of migrating files to an agreed upon file format as soon as the records are ingested into the archive. So you might say, no matter what type of digital image format these records come in, we're going to take everything and we're going to normalize it or migrate it into a TIFF file, because that is a file format that we feel comfortable maintaining over time and providing access to. And so we're just going to do that right off the bat. We're not going to wait for any kind of future events to compel us to migrate records, say a risk of file format obsolescence or any other issues. We're just going to be very proactive, and we're just going to do this right off the bat. So this sort of sub-form of migration, I call it, it's just migration that's done proactively instead of at a later date. Is really meant to reduce future preservation actions in the future. So just trying to really simplify things and say, as soon as this type of file format comes in, we're going to change it to this file format. And then we know that ideally we can just kind of sit back and not have to intervene with these records for the foreseeable future. The Digby and Durant article argues that normalization has become somewhat passé as a preservation strategy due to the increased accessibility of emulation. And I think one of the Owens chapters talked about this as well, that if you have this added step of migrating things right off the bat, then you may be engaging in unnecessary work. It may not necessarily be important or a requirement for you to normalize records. It may be perfectly fine to provide an emulator, and we'll talk more about emulators later, obviously, or to just let the record remain as it is, and not take such a proactive step to change things. It may be unnecessary. It may result in work that you don't have to do. So there are a few different reasons why normalization is not as widespread or accepted as a preservation strategy as it once was. You know, there certainly are benefits for it. If you are an archive that doesn't have a ton of resources and you just want to just kind of do something and get things in decent shape and get things into a condition where you're not going to have to worry about them for a particular amount of time, you're willing to lose some of the authenticity of the record, then the normalization is perfectly fine. But there are also some arguments against doing normalization. And as always, it's good to consider the pros and cons of digital preservation strategies before you engage in them. So as I mentioned before, a big thing is knowing which files or which file formats to normalize or migrate your records to. So if you start in TIFFville, you have to know why you're going to migrate to JPEG and not to another digital image file format. So this really goes back to the nature of migration and the changes to the record that changing a file format causes to occur. So if you take a TIFF and you change it to a JPEG, there are going to be changes to the record. They may not be significant, but there are going to be changes to the record. And so you just want to make sure that the file format that you're migrating to isn't going to be one that changes the significant properties of the record. So you have to know that if you change something from a TIFF to a JPEG and then provide access to that JPEG, it's not going to undermine or detract from the overall authenticity or the value of the significant properties of the record. And we've talked about this a lot in this course, but a good way to make that determination is to have a conversation with researchers and stakeholders to find out what are going to be the implications for them if you migrate records from one file format to another. So if you migrate a record from a WAV file to an MP3, and that results in a loss of information due to compression, is that something that your researchers and stakeholders are willing to accept, and is it something that they can live with? Or should you think about an alternative migration pathway to pursue? Maybe there's another file format that is still fairly accessible, that still has some of the benefits of an MP3, but maybe results in little or no compression and little or no loss of information. So that's just a conversation that you have to have as an archive and in collaboration with other parties as well. And you want to make sure that you have your justification for why you're migrating or normalize into a particular file format recorded in your preservation plan. So the really detailed behind the scenes look at your digital preservation activities. Again, just so that people know that you did consider different options, that you did consider the potential losses of information that are attached to particular options, and then you just really took the time to think about alternatives and how migrating to a certain file format might impact your researchers. Another thing about this and about migration in general is that you have to be aware of which file formats are preservation risks to begin with. So obviously, if a file format isn't a long-term preservation risk, then you don't necessarily have to migrate it. You can just, again, kind of let it ride. If a file format is one that is fairly accessible to people, then you don't necessarily need to migrate it. You can just copy your original record and provide access to that. And you don't have to go to the trouble of migrating it and then providing access to that migrated copy. So it all just goes back to the idea of knowing your file formats and knowing which ones are going to have utility for you and which ones you should be more wary of. The last thing that you want to do is migrate your records into a file format that is at risk for obsolescence or may be in danger of becoming more difficult to access in the future. So you just have to be aware of what the risks are out there. There are a lot of great resources about preferred and acceptable file formats, and we've looked at some of them in this course. So those can be great resources for deciding which records need to be migrated first of all, and which records or which file formats migrated records should be migrated to. So that combined with the discussion about what information you want to make sure you preserve can go a long way towards providing access to records that are as authentic as you can. Okay, so next we'll talk about emulation. And so as the Gattuso article notes, emulation is focused on providing the as-was experience for those accessing files. So providing an experience that as well as possible represents the experience of the person who created and used the file at its beginning or at its epoch, I think the article says. So emulation is really designed to provide a way for researchers today to go back and experience that. So this is a type of digital preservation or a digital preservation strategy that's more aligned with artifactual preservation, since the digital item itself is not changed. So the file format remains the same. Emulation just provides the environment that the file can be accessed through. So as Costa states, I think I was mispronouncing that earlier, emulation focuses not on the digital object, but recreating the environment in which the digital object can be presented in authentic form. So again, there's a real emphasis on authenticity and maintaining the significant properties of a record as much as possible and providing access to those significant properties in an authentic manner. The Carta article lists a few things that authentic emulators should incorporate. So the aesthetic, functional, and interactive components of a digital object. So to take this image from an emulator for Earthbound, which was a really kind of groundbreaking Super Nintendo game. It's one that I grew up just loving playing it. You can talk about the aesthetic component. So making sure that the font in the emulator looks the same as it does within the game itself, making sure that the colors around these borders, making sure that the characters look the same, the background look the same, and things like that. Looking at functional, so just how the game itself plays, making sure that the gameplay is relatively similar, and that the game just has the overall function as it did on its original hardware, in this case, the Super Nintendo. And also the interactive components is an interesting one to consider. So having some kind of controller that you can use for an emulator that might mimic the original hardware that the game was created on. So I know that there are emulators for Super Nintendo games where you use a controller which very closely replicates the old Super Nintendo controller that those of us who are old enough to remember love and cherish. So if you combine these three things, if you have an emulator that can incorporate the aesthetic, functional, and interactive components of a digital object, then you're likely to, again, allow yourself or allow your researchers to experience the as-was experience, and experience as close to what the creator of the file or what users of the files experienced when the file was created and used. The Carta article gives a good example of Duck Hunt, how with modern computers there isn't the tube, I guess, that the old Duck Hunt zapper corresponded to. And if you just used a controller, then that's not really an authentic emulation because it's not really the same as how the old Duck Hunt game worked and how people interacted with it. So I thought that was a good example of what makes an emulation a good emulator. Exactly what features of a game or a digital object should be included in the emulator can be difficult to decide. And the Carta article mentions having some determination made by a community of users. So again, this just goes back to the idea of having collaboration with your researchers and experts to decide what features of a file are important to include or have represented in an emulator, because these are the people that have maybe used a particular piece of hardware or a particular program before, so they might know best what were the most important features of it, what significant properties are the most important to preserve. Emulators can be great for providing an authentic experience and interaction with a record, but there are some downsides to emulators as well. As the Costa article notes, the legality of emulators might be more questionable due to copyright and legal issues. So that article includes a quote from someone from Nintendo who basically said, emulators are theft because if you buy and use an emulator, then you're not buying and using a Super Nintendo or the games that people play on Super Nintendos. So there might be some issues such as those related to copyright, and copyright is also mentioned later on when the Carta article provides some examples of different types of emulators that archives are offering. With the Yale one, it basically says we may not be able to provide access to this emulator due to license/copyright issues. So that's something that may limit the accessibility of files in an emulated environment. The card article is really focused on metadata and how that connects to emulators, and it discusses metadata as a really important sort of descriptor of emulators and of the digital records that kind of correspond with emulators, and why it's important to have an understanding of all the different softwares and hardwares and other features of digital records. But the article also notes that metadata might be scarce due to a lack of official sources. So it might be difficult to determine and describe what emulators get right, especially if publishers have shut down and there just isn't a whole lot of information about different aspects of digital records. And so if you don't know what those are, especially complicated digital records like video games, which emulators are really meant to address, as opposed to the more simple types of records that migration addresses, there just might not be as much information out there that allows or helps archivists and other people understand these digital records and the formats that they might be in. So that can make it difficult to find emulators that really can provide an authentic representation of a digital record if you don't really know much about the digital record itself. Another difficulty might be linking researchers with the best emulator for a particular type of content or for a particular purpose. So there might be a lot of variance in emulator quality out there, and that's something that the Carta article touches on as well. So you may only be able to access an emulator that doesn't preserve significant properties or essential properties that you need for your purpose. And that can be problematic as well. Just the overall quality of the emulator can really determine the utility of a file. And it's also interesting to wonder if authentic emulation is always the best solution or always the best idea. So the Hedstrom article that we looked at earlier on in the semester talked about how in some cases having an emulator that takes parts of a digital record and makes the digital record more usable and more accessible might actually be beneficial, even if it reduces the authenticity of the record. So sometimes emulators might have features that are desirable to researchers, but not authentic to the original. So maybe more options to save your game if it's a video game. I don't know, improved sound effects or just other tweaks that, again, may detract from the authenticity of the digital record, but might actually be more beneficial for researchers and just make the digital record more accessible and easier to work with. So there's definitely some tension between usability and accessibility and authenticity. It's a tension that we've talked about throughout this semester, and it's certainly one that is present in emulation and in the idea of emulators as well. Another interesting consideration is that as emulation technology progresses, the emulators that archivists use to provide access to files might change over time as well. So at one point in time, you may have a file in its original format that's accessed through emulator 1, but as technology changes, as the quality of emulators improves, or you discover an emulator that works better for a particular type of file, you may provide access to a file in its original format through emulator number 2, and then so on as time and technology progresses. So kind of similar to how you have to think about which records you're going to migrate files as file formats change and as technology changes. it seems like it's a good idea to be aware of how emulation changes. And if there are emulators out there that might be more beneficial for your researchers and maybe provide a more authentic experience or a more accessible experience for your researchers. I think if you just find one emulator and you kind of stick with it, then maybe the emulator that you're using isn't the best and maybe there's a better alternative out there. So it's always good to just kind of be aware of what emulators are out there and which emulators might be the best match for the type of file you're trying to emulate at a given time. So I'm really going to go out on a limb here, and talk about the sea slug Elysia marginate as a metaphor for emulation. So I just learned about these fascinating creatures the other day. So these are sea slugs, and they're just beautiful and amazing animals with a really unique characteristic of if their body becomes riddled with parasites, then they decapitate themselves. And over a course of a few weeks, grow an entirely new body that doesn't have parasites. And I feel like this is a good metaphor for emulation. So rather than taking the thoughts and memories and experiences of the sea slug and putting it into a different body, like the body of maybe a different type of sea slug or a different animal entirely, you are simply, the sea slug is simply developing another environment to sort of live in and to be represented by. So the former would be an example of migration, right? So you're taking the informational content in a record, or in this case, the sea slug's sort of memories and experiences, and you're transferring them to a different body or a different animal entirely, quite possibly. And that's going to result in, again, a loss of authenticity. It's going to result in the sea slug behaving in ways that it wouldn't normally, because suddenly it's in the body of a different animal. But with the sea slug regrowing its own body, that would be an example of the sea slug expressing itself through an environment. So the environment is changing, and not the sea slug or how the sea slug acts or is represented. So as soon as I learned about this animal the other day, I was like, that sounds a lot like emulation. And it may be a little bit of a stretch, but I think you can make the point that that is an appropriate metaphor. Again, rather than just throwing the sea slug's mind experiences into a different body, the content stays the same, and it just finds a new environment to express itself through, or it regrows a new body. Talk about a fascinating creature, right? Imagine if people could do that. Once you hit 40 and things started to get a little pudgier on the midsection, you can just cut your own head off and regrow a new body and look like a 20-year-old again, which would just be great. So kudos to Elysia marginate. So why not both? Oftentimes, migration and emulation is viewed as kind of a duality. You do one or the other, but the Gattuso article suggests that it's possible to have both of these preservation activities represented within your archive. And that the context of the institution doing the preservation should really determine how these different preservation strategies are mixed. And this decision can really be based on the archives articulating what do we want to preserve? What is the goal of our preservation efforts? What are we trying to accomplish? Are we just trying to provide informational content, in which case we're mostly going to focus on migration? Are we trying to provide more artifactual content, in which case we would focus on emulation? What is the intent of our preservation? What aspects of our records do we think are important? And the answer to that question will really lead you to making a determination about which preservation strategy you're going to embrace. And again, it doesn't have to be, all or nothing. You can choose to maybe migrate a vast majority of your records, but if you feel like a collection or even particular records within a collection have particular value for researchers and for your institution, then you may decide to provide access to those records in an emulated environment as opposed to migrating the records and then providing access to those migrated records. Another great thing would be to consider the needs of your researchers and incorporate that into your decision of whether or not, or whether you're going to migrate records or emulate them. And you also need to consider the resources of your archive as well. If your archive doesn't have the expertise that's required to provide emulated access to records, then that may preclude you from doing so. If you just don't know how to find the best emulator for the records that you're trying to provide access to, then maybe you shouldn't risk it, and you should find another solution. But if mixing emulation and migration is a strategy that your archive can pull off, then having that amount of flexibility within your repository and having flexibility in how you preserve your records and how you provide access to the records that you preserve can really be a big benefit. And it can allow you to potentially meet the needs of your researchers and stakeholders in a more comprehensive fashion than if you just say, it's migration or nothing at all. So just thinking strategically and thinking flexibly, I think is a really good perspective to have. And the Gattuso article provides some good examples of what mixing migration and emulation, even within the same records, in a couple of examples can look like. So having talked a little bit about migration and emulation, let's compare them to permanence. So because of the loss of authenticity and the changes to significant properties that can or typically are associated with migration, that is more of a Christian Bale and the Machinist type of permanence. So you are going to lose potentially a lot of information. A lot of information can change, and that's going to result in a loss or altering of information, authenticity, significant properties, and some of the other things that we've talked about in this class. Whereas emulation is more of a Batman Christian Bale, where you, as much as possible, are providing a representation of the look and feel of records as close to the creation as possible. And going back to the idea of resources, migration is fairly inexpensive to do, and it doesn't really require a lot of expertise or a lot of skill to do it, whereas emulation can be more resource intensive, simply because you have to know how to set up emulators, you have to know how to provide access to them, you have to know which emulators are out there and which ones are the best to choose. And there can just be a variety of issues that go into providing emulated access to records. Next, we'll talk about the connections between migration and emulation and ingest. And ideally, it's going to start right here when you're looking at the records of the people that are going to be potentially donating records to your archives. You might begin to say, okay, these records are in this format, so according to our digital preservation plan, we should think about migrating them at some point, or even we should normalize them when they come into our repository. You might identify records that you feel are important enough to emulate and begin thinking about how you're going to do that. During negotiation, you might work with your donors to encourage them to provide records that are in file formats that won't need to be migrated or emulated because they are fairly straightforward and accessible, and that will save you some work. So it may be possible for you to have a relationship with the donor that precludes the need for migration or emulation at all. That may be less likely if you're getting files that are a little bit older, as may be the case. When you are identifying and analyzing your records, if you don't already have a good picture of the file formats in your in the collection, then this may be a time where you identify records that may need to be migrated or emulated in the future. So this can be a good opportunity to identify some of those problematic file formats that you're going to have to address at some point down the line. And so this identification and analyzation phase can be a good way to do that. And maybe if you say, well, we realize that if we want to preserve these records, we're going to have to, migrate thousands and thousands of records, and we don't really feel like that's worth the effort, then, you might choose not to ultimately accession those records into your archive. And then accessibility, obviously the goal of migration is to provide records in a format that is easier for your researchers to access and is easier for you to provide access in. Again, ideally with as little cost or little impact on the record's authenticity as possible. Or in the case of emulation, to provide access to records in the most authentic manner possible. So both of these actions are fundamentally geared around the idea of providing access to records. And with one, there's more of a sacrifice of authenticity and significant properties than there is with the other. You just have to kind of pick and choose which one works best for your repository in a given situation. So we've touched on the connections to authenticity and migration and emulation already on in this lecture, so I won't belabor the point too much. But again, the migration options that you choose are going to have varying impacts on the authenticity of the records that viewers interact with. So if you take a file format and you migrate it to one file format, it may have different impacts on the authenticity than if you migrate the records to a different file format. And that's just something that you have to be aware of. And you can make the case that that's true for emulation as well. If you choose to pick one emulator to provide access to your records as opposed to another emulator, then that may impact how authentic your records are. Again, it just goes back to the idea of knowing what file formats or what emulators are out there and available, and making a determination about which is the best option given a particular given a particular context and given the impact that choosing one file format or one emulator is going to have on the authenticity and significant properties of your records. You know, ideally, emulators provide an authentic experience, but if you choose an emulator that really disrupts the aesthetic, functional, and interactive aspects of a record, then I don't know, is that really much of a benefit? That's just something that your archive has to think over and decide. But you know, even emulators can represent things incorrectly. Just because something says it's an emulator doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to provide an authentic representation of a record. You still have to do your homework, and you still have to kind of experiment and decide which emulators might work better than other emulators. Okay, so we'll go ahead and call it a lecture there. Migration and emulation are in some ways a necessary evil. You know, if we could wave a magic wand and we could have researchers access records on the hardware and using the software that the record creator did when the record was created, that would be great. But due to technological limitations, due to resource limitations, that's just not possible. And so migration and emulation are two workarounds that archives have embraced, two preservation actions that archives have embraced in order to make records more accessible. And again, kind of a necessary evil, especially perhaps migration, although as I've talked about in this lecture, even emulation can have some questionable aspects of it. But again, it all goes back to knowing what your archives can handle from a resource perspective, from a sustainability perspective. It all goes back to having an understanding of what your researchers and stakeholders want and the type of access that they want, and doing your best within your means to provide that type of access to your records. And again, that will really influence the file formats and emulators that you choose to use to make your records more accessible. And you know, it can have a pretty profound impact if you migrate something and it really changes the records, and you multiply that across thousands and thousands of records. That can result in a lot of information being lost, or at least a lot of information being inaccessible to researchers, and that can have some pretty obvious implications on things like social memory and how researchers interpret and understand records that they're given. So it's always important to make clear to researchers why they're looking at records in a particular format or on a particular emulator, and that what they're looking at may be a record that has some authenticity challenges. Again, just so that they're aware of what they're looking at and the path that a record is taken to get to the point where a researcher is able to interact with it and work with it in an accessible manner. So again, some echoes for things that we've talked about already in this course, but hopefully this discussion has provided a little bit more food for thought about migration and emulation. And as always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and stay safe and have a great week.